Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending our Questline webinar on the ins and outs of utility customer journey mapping. My name is Maureen Murky, and I'm the technical producer of today's webinar. Before we begin, we want to cover just a few housekeeping items. To the left of your screen are multiple application widgets you can use. Most of the widgets are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to get the most of your desktop space. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A widget, which is directly below the presentation window. We will try to answer all questions during the webcast, but if a more in-depth answer is needed or we run out of time, they will be answered later via email. Some networks may cause slides to advance more slowly than others, so logging off of your VPN is recommended. If your slides do fall behind, pushing F5 on your keyboard will refresh the page. If you do experience any other disruptions during the broadcast, please use the Q&A widget for any technical questions. We will be sending everyone a follow-up email within the next few days, which will include a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation and the playback link to the recording of today's webinar. We will also be conducting poll questions during the presentation and would greatly appreciate your participation. Please be aware that you are not the only participant today. The names of the other attendees are not being shown to you for privacy. Now, let me introduce today's host. Brian Olson is a senior energy analyst for Questline. After he received his master's in environmental management from IIT, Brian began his energy career with Sargent and Lundy as an environmental engineer. He then spent over a decade with the U.S. Department of Energy's Midwest Regional Office as their industrial and commercial energy efficiency program manager. Just prior to joining Questline, he taught at Ecotech Institute, a school for solar and wind technician training in Colorado. At Questline, Brian writes articles for newsletters, answers technical inquiries, and develops webinars on energy topics. And now I'll go ahead and turn it over to Brian, who will introduce our guests and get things started for us today.
Thank you, Maureen, and welcome everyone to another webinar in our Plugged In series. This month's topic will be utility customer journey mapping. So here's the agenda. As shown in the agenda, the webinar will begin by looking at exactly what customer journey maps are. From there, our speakers will go through the benefits of customer journey maps, why we want them, and how to create them. Finally, they'll cover what is to do after you've created a customer journey map, and then we'll open the floor for answering questions from our audience. Just find the widget on the left side of your screen with the question mark icon, click and submit your questions at any time during the presentation. Before we begin though, let me introduce our two speakers. Brent Baker is the VP Chief Customer Officer for the City Utilities of Springfield, Missouri, and is responsible for customer-focused strategy, customer operations, advanced metering infrastructure initiatives, as well as transit systems. Prior to joining City Utilities in May of 2020, Mr. Baker was National Vice President of Customer Experience for Liberty Utilities and oversaw the customer experience teams in 13 states and 2 provinces in the United States and Canada. Mr. Baker received a Bachelor of Science degree in Civil Engineering at the Missouri University of Science and Technology. He is also a registered professional engineer in Missouri. Zach Hardison is a strategy and innovation expert with more than 15 years of experience solving complex problems with healthcare, energy, technology, and financial services from concept all the way to execution. He's an advocate of humor-centered design, an idea provocateur, and believes in progress over perfection. With a passion for creative writing, he loves contemporary methods of storytelling and coffee shop conversation. I'm now going to take a chance here and launch our first poll question in hopes of finding out just how much of you already have experience with this area. So if you could answer the following question and just click on which one applies to you. What customer experience are you most interested in mapping out? Number 1, billing and payments. 2, new customers. 3, outage communications. 4, energy efficiency journeys. 5, marketplaces. And 6, other, if you don't see what your best option is on the 5 above. So let's take a look, and it looks like we've got a lot of people involved in outage communications, energy efficiency journeys. Looks like energy efficiency journeys is taking a little bit of a lead here. So Okay, let's move forward. And looks like the slight lead goes to energy. Actually, outage communications and energy efficiency journeys seem to be the similar weighted, and hopefully we can use that going forward. Now I'll pass the slides off to Zach and Brent, who will take us through the customer journey mapping. Zach, please take control.
Thank you, Brian. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Brent, if you'd like to tee us off, please.
You bet. So you all heard in the introduction, I started off my career doing engineering and have an engineering background. And I think it's important to think about journey maps a little bit as a process, design process, but it really is different as it's a design framework that helps us solve customer problems really with the customer in mind. I've seen journey maps help us in different organizations that I've been a part of to really see it from a different perspective. We oftentimes would go into more of the utility mindset of how to design something and design around our limitations. Journey maps really help us elevate our minds into what it is like to be our customer and to develop the processes to improve with the customer really as our focus.
Thank you, Brent. So to get into some of the tactical details of how you define a journey map, what they are. Everyone has a clearly defined start and stopping point for whatever desired experience you want. You can make it as long as you'd like or as narrow as you like, but the idea is that there is a clear starting and stopping point, and then you would imagine stitching together multiple experiences and multiple journey maps to help a customer basically navigate their way through your brand, your company, a particular action, whatever it might be. And some of the things that they are inclusive of, certainly actions, any actions that the customer is taking, any action that you are taking on your side. Emotions definitely plays a big role in this as well, how they're feeling at a particular point along the journey, how your own employees, your own staff might be feeling about a particular journey. And then behaviors, are they actually moving and behaving in a way that is by design, or have they found a loophole that they're going around? Are they getting stuck and there's a swirl? So all these three things we tend to look at when we're doing a journey map, just so we can capture the full range of actions, emotions, and behaviors within the experience. So next, why do we want them? What are the big benefits out of giving those? Some of the general high-level benefits out of this. One, you can use them for strategy and resource planning. So where do you want to spend your effort? If you identify an experience or a journey that's particularly painful, for example, you're trying to convert a customer to a particular CTA, and they're bouncing out higher than anywhere else. This might be a place that you identify a particularly high investment in resources, and then you can use that into your long-term strategy and road mapping goals. Definitely you want to identify customer pain points. What is the worst thing that they feel about it? Where do they really get hindered in moving through your experience, moving through the process? Gives you a little bit more insight into certainly how they feel about you too as a company, as a brand, as an experience. The reverse of that, then, of course, is actually making it not a pain point and then using it as a leverage to improve customer satisfaction. It's real easy for folks to identify what they don't like about an experience. Of course, that's what they will always usually comment on first, is what they don't like. And customers have this expectation of when things go right, they tend not to comment on it because it just meets their expectations, right? But this is a way that you can actually measure notable improvement by removing pain points or improving them over time. You can actually track that through the end result of a customer satisfaction score. And then lastly, you can use it to identify any operational inefficiencies. Are you slowing down the process on your side and the customer's kind of just waiting in limbo? As one example, there's opportunities there to cost savings, operational performance, a number of things that you can see where there might be swirl happening within there. I'll turn to Brent if you got anything you'd like to weigh in on in terms of how these benefits might relate specifically to utilities.
You bet. Yeah. So you covered it really well. I actually see this as journey maps as a catalyst to bringing a more customer-focused culture into an organization. So oftentimes when we have looked at fixing a problem, like I mentioned early on in mentioning journey maps, is that we found limits either with our IT systems or one department or another that just maybe can't do those things that we might need, that we think we need to do for a customer. So what I really see this from the utility perspective is building that culture of focusing on the customer and really just being relentless to solving those customer problems. And that journey mapping process can bring operations people, IT people, and customer and communications groups together to really solve problems differently than you had before.
Excellent. Next, we're going to run through several real-world examples that everybody can relate to. There's no needed extra knowledge. I'm a big fan of using analogies and metaphors and similar industry stories to highlight a point. So we'll go through one for Ford. We'll cover one on Disney. Then we have a healthcare example, and probably my personal passion to heart is a Starbucks experience design example. So to kick us off, I'll run through Ford's. Let's see, about 12 years ago now, Ford had an idea to make opening a car door way easier than it currently was at the time. And initially, they mapped out what the experience could look like. And they decided on a digital interface via your smartphone. And they quite literally mapped out these steps and just put them on Post-its on a board. And you can see it's walk up to my car, pull up my smartphone, wake up my phone, slide to unlock it, passcode, sea of icons, tap the icon. And they got all the way to the end, and it just resulted in physically opening the car door. And it didn't really get them that much further. And then they put that side by side and said, well, here's me. I put a digital interface in the middle, where in reality, it's just my goal. So they realized that this was an example of over-engineering a solution where actually a digital solve via your smartphone or via an app actually hindered and made the experience far worse than what they were hoping for. It took them this effort, though, in mapping it out and journeying it to get them to what the end result was, which is actually Ford's liftgate model, the kick gate. You just throw your foot under the back of your car and your liftgate opens up automatically. This example, this journey map, is actually the genesis of what led them to such a much more user-friendly and easily accessible solution to opening the car door if your hands are full. So it's a good example of highlighting some inefficiencies about how you might be thinking about it and how technology might not always be the best foot forward in this case. I'll move over to Brent, and he's going to run us through our Disney example.
You bet. So I was fortunate enough several years ago to be able to go through the Disney Institute, and part of that was focused on journey maps. And a lot of it, this example actually highlights their focus on employee empowerment. And so in this example, Disney started to have trouble with some of their resorts not having rooms ready for customers when they checked in or for guests when they checked in. Those delays, as they looked through, those came to light through the frustrations that customers were showing in the journey mapping process that Disney evaluated that experience at many different touch points. As they evaluated why check-in was being delayed so often, they saw a process that bubbled up from union employees that said, when we went away from the smaller linen delivery vehicles to the larger linen vehicles, it made it more difficult for us to be prepared for early check-ins and to get the early linens in some of the rooms. So after all of that evaluation, the recommendation coming up from the employees allowed Disney to buy a couple more Cushmans than what they had, the little vehicles to move the linens around, and actually bought them a linen folding machine. And after a little bit of time, the success of this, they bought another linen machine and even added another Cushman to that. And so if any of you have been through that Disney experience and seen that example, it's pretty impressive how they use the journey map to find the problem, but also relied on their employees to help come up with the solution. So real opportunity with customer journey maps to also learn about employee journey maps and what it's like to be an employee and a customer.
Thank you, Brent. Now we'll move over to our Starbucks example. If anyone was unaware, Starbucks is actually not in the business of selling coffee. They sell an experience. They're very aware of it. They're very good at it. But they do that by personalizing as much as they possibly can for you, their customer. So your cup, your name on the cup, the fact that they call out your name, the fact that they have 20 different varieties of gift cards at point of sale, all the different tumblers, and other merchandise. It's tailored to you and then reinforced by your engagement and purchase history. And they aggregate all of that data across all of their physical retail sites. to come up with new designs and continually push things out because they want you to feel an emotional connection every time you walk into that store. As much as they can tailor it to you and have you have an emotional connection to it, they're going to push that to you. But the really interesting thing is where they excel, certainly in recent history, is choice of channel. And so they realized that early on, there was a certain type of demographic customer segment that liked the morning experience of walking into their local Starbucks, waiting in line, chatting with their barista. Their barista could greet them by name. They could get to a point where they knew their usual drink order and already start making it behind at the bar. There were a segment of people within there that didn't quite like it, and for a variety of reasons. Maybe they weren't particularly extroverted. Maybe they didn't really like engaging in small talk. They were in much more of a hurry and didn't like the fact that they had to wait for a little bit of time. So Starbucks expanded, created the new channel of the drive-through. So it's you still get a little bit of interaction with your barista at the window. They still can get to know you to a degree and get used to seeing you, and you're out a little bit further. They then took another step further and looked at that segment and realized there was actually even another group within there that didn't like that experience also. And so that's when they really invested heavily in mobile and mobile purchases in the mobile app. And so now they have 3 distinct channels that a user and a customer can self-select, pick what they really like, prefer. And the mobile customer is somebody who can order their drink via their app. They have a dedicated mobile pickup spot for when you walk in. You can literally order your drink, walk in and get it, and have never spoken to a Starbucks employee at all. And of course, largely driven by the pandemic, but even prior to that, it was already accelerating. Mobile app purchases were more than a quarter of all sales for them. And in 2021, they actually began shutting down stores in favor of renovating and just eliminating completely their in-store dining as an option, because they recognized that consumer behavior and expectations were moving further and further away from the in-store and pushing more to drive-through and mobile. And the last example I'll cover is our healthcare example, just to show how identifying some engagement points can lead to a complete overhaul of transformational experiences. So imagine a scenario where you wake up and you feel unwell, you need to go visit your primary care doctor, and imagine then you need to be referred to a specialist. In this particular journey that I was involved in, we identified 11 points of engagement as opportunities to completely overhaul and transform. So as a result of it, there was a virtual health program that was created out of it. There was a new patient type that actually included a new billing type and even legislation put down to paper, and an on-demand referral prototype. So imagine a scenario where, like I said, you feel unwell, you're a new patient, and you call a doctor's office. You might be looking at an appointment that's 2 to 4 weeks out because you're not established. If you're already established, it can be 48 hours that you get an appointment, or even the same day. So let's say you take the appointment, but then you feel better. How easy is it to cancel your appointment? How likely are you to cancel your appointment if you reach out? In traveling to the appointment, do you have to take time off of work and therefore you lose money out of your paycheck, and you have to be forced with this decision making of, do I go to my doctor appointment or do I buy groceries? Do you need child care just to allocate the time that you need to go to the appointment? Is a virtual appointment better for you because you don't have the travel time and the wait time? How long are you in the waiting room before you get up and decide to leave? And then once you actually get that referral, if it's 6 to 8 weeks out, what we found was, especially depending on the referral, if you go in and your doctor says, there's something odd with your heart, which is a very real scenario that we heard quite often, but I don't quite know what it is, I need to refer you to a cardiologist. It can take you 6 to 8 weeks to see a cardiologist. Well, you're not likely to wait 6 to 8 weeks. You're more likely to go to the emergency room, because as a consumer, people know if I go to the emergency room and tell them there's something going on with my heart, I can see a cardiologist in about 30 seconds because it's an emergency for them and they want to make sure that you're safe. But it's not the ideal state for a healthcare system or a hospital by any means. So there was a number of points, as you can see throughout this journey, that we were able to identify as things that we could totally transform create new solutions out of and new programs that were not just better for the health system itself, but they were actually phenomenally better for the patient in terms of their own health, and then certainly better in terms of their own experience. So Brian, I'll turn it back over to you for our second poll question now.
Thank you, Zach. And second poll question is, do you currently utilize any consumer journey mapping strategies when planning communications or new programs? So yes, no, not yet, but planning to. Take a quick chance to answer that. And some really good information so far. Journey maps factoring in actions, emotions, and behaviors. Try to rely on all parties involved to generate the most comprehensive journey map that you can, and then reinforce it by points of engagement and purchase history, and then considering make your approach even more robust by offering choices of channel. Looks like a lot of people are interested in using the journey mapping strategy, and we've got a few people that are still doing it already. But looks like a lot of people are interested in it. So, all right, we're going to move on to the next section. Zach, if you'd take it away.
Thanks, Brian. And then Brett, if you want to tee us up a little bit on how we go about creating customer journey maps.
Brent, you're muted. We're working here, seeing if Brent has his. Looks like he. Brent, can you hear us? I'm not hearing Brent right now. Zach, you want to
Sure.
riff while we get back, Brent?
You got it. I'll keep us moving right along here. So on how we go about creating these, there's a number of things you can start with. If you already have experiences you want to analyze because maybe you've got a good hunch or a hypothesis on something that you want to fix, you want to optimize, you want to enhance, by all means, you can start with those and again, identify your clear start and stop points. Next, you want to identify the users in your experience. So this can be as nuanced as you would like. So it's certainly more than just blanket customer. In the healthcare example, to use that, you could identify patient, but then you could also identify caregivers of a patient. You can identify patients that are technologically savvy, patients who are not technologically savvy. You can segment them however you like that makes sense for your experience, and then identify your primary, your secondary, your tertiary customers or your users in the experience. And that just sets you up long term to know who you should be building and designing your experience for. The next step being, of course, then you cluster those users into distinct groups. In the Starbucks example, it's, are you a mobile customer or a drive-through? And you're going to design your experience and you're going to build out different experiences based on what you know about those clusters and what you know about those groups. The next step from there is something I very highly recommend, which is just one-to-one interviewing your users directly. Just get that direct input. You don't need to do dozens and dozens of them. Quite honestly, you can learn a ton by just doing a handful, and you can get real insight into, again, those earlier steps we showed earlier, their emotions, their behaviors as they move through an example. They'll tell you everything that you want to know and everything that you probably don't want to hear, but it's actually a really good insight to hear it directly from them, because it gives you a very highly objective view of your own company, of your own experience that can be a little bit hard for you to detach yourself from. Brett, I'll throw it back to you, see if we got you back now.
You bet. Can you hear me now?
There we go.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. I had a few audio issues that popped up here just a little bit. So I was going to focus on, and great examples that Zach has, I was going to focus a little bit on just my experience of trying to get the experience identified that we would want to analyze. And so at a utility, there's many different areas that we could look into, but
I found it a little bit hard to get traction sometimes into what is really important and why we should go down this path. And so whether you're evaluating a JD Power score or beginning to measure customer satisfaction, or there's a pain point that in the community is recognized, find a way to kind of go, work with your others in your organization to find out what is most important and identify an experience that many would agree with. And so later on, I'll talk about the outage journey that I've worked on a little bit and working on here. But I think that's one that many people can agree we need to improve on, but not everybody agrees with how. And so, as Zach mentioned, interviewing your customers and getting some one-on-one conversations with those customers, not just in a broad-based survey, but to ask the customers what they expect during an outage experience or any other journey that you're going through, to really have an interview conversation with them about what their expectations really are. I think that highlights that experience that's outside of your business and a little bit more helpful to design it that would be meaningful to the customer.
That's a very good point, Brett. I don't know if you found it in your own experience, but I know that when I've talked to users before, as soon as I tell them why I'm interested in talking to them, it's almost like I can almost hear and see a physical change in their demeanor. Like they're suddenly way more willing, way more open. I'm not calling about a past due bill, or I'm not calling about a complaint or anything that you registered. Like if I start the conversation by saying, look, we're trying to do better, and I want you to educate me, and I want your opinion and input to help drive what we do differently in the future. People just open up, and they're willing to talk to you for a lot longer than I've originally asked for.
That's right. And the other good point of that is that when you bring those conversations or videos in and let others in the organization hear what customers really think, it really pulls down a lot of curtains that you may have in the past been able to put up and guard yourself against really seeing the whole experience that customers have.
I like that a lot. It's letting your customer make the argument for you.
Right.
I've definitely taken advantage of that more than one occasion in conference room and boardrooms. And if somebody wants to disagree, it's like, okay, well, you're not disagreeing with me. Let me put the exact verbatim comment that our customers, our users have said. And it's hard to argue with that. When you can see it firsthand and put it in front of folks like that.
Right.
Well, we'll move on to, as Brent mentioned, a couple of our examples. So we'll do our utility customer journey first. I'll run through that, and then we'll hand it over to Brent again to run through an outage communications journey specific to our industry. So for the customer engagement opportunity, this is a map that we've created and used to highlight kind of not only the chaos, but also just the complexity that is open to customers in terms of choice and how they can engage with you, where they can engage with you. This actually visual here, if you think it looks chaotic, it's actually probably a disservice to how chaotic and complex it truly actually is. If you were to map out every single engagement point. But as a visual, it just serves up the point to really be a catalyst to start asking some of those objective questions on, how are you educating your customers on outages, pricing and value of your service, the energy products you might bring forward to them, their own energy use, what community systems or infrastructure investments are you making to build up your community reputation, who wants to be communicated to via text versus email versus phone versus online chat versus social media channels, what product recommendations are you making versus for, smart thermostat, energy efficiency appliances, what guidance and expertise are you providing for customers who may be interested in solar panels or EVs? Are you getting those messages out into the community? Are you matching the segments with the message with the right medium to reach them? And then lastly, do all of these engagement points with your customers feel like one cohesive experience? Or if they, do they feel disjointed if they go over here and call your call center versus get a paper bill versus go into your mobile app? The ideal state being that all of these things feel naturally connected, not only for the user themselves and the customer, but then also on your end, and have a historical record to know, all right, Zach got a paper bill, he went online, he took this action, and you know how engaged I am as a customer or disengaged, and can possibly use me as an example to retarget and reach out to as one example. All right, and then we'll go over to Brent to walk us through the outage journey.
You bet. And this is just an overview of a lot of the customer journeys, and I'm going to talk a little bit more just about what to decide on. And so you can pick any of these journeys, but the two on the right here, experiencing an outage or having an emergency service request, are really, I think, moments of frustration for a lot of our customers, and a great place for us to begin getting operations and IT groups together and communications as well with the customer group. So I find the outage conversation, the outage experience, to be one that's really helpful. And so setting up a cross-functional team to develop that journey map really helps expedite the improvements in my mind and my experiences. But taking unplanned outages as an example, it's key to define the touch points or the key points in that experience to really encourage the team to think like a customer. And one example of that is you may develop a customer engagement tool, but then the question comes of how often should you be texting your customers about that outage? What information should you be providing the customers during that outage? And I think internally, I've experienced, some resistance from time to time about providing an estimated restore time. It requires a lot from the operations groups to be out in the field restoring power, to have to stop and provide accurate estimated restore time information. But if we're looking at it from the customer's experience, we recognize that that is really important. The other question comes up is, should we text the customers regularly through an outage, or should we just put out kind of the Domino's pizza tracker example and let it be tracked and let the customers find us? So that is something that when you do those interviews with customers and get more of that information, you can really develop what your customers want based on that, rather than it be something that comes down to a departmental decision on what is most expedient for inside the company. So really going through those steps of experiencing an outage and putting those points in a journey and evaluating that with others in mind and listening to the customers will really help you do what's right for your organization.
Brent, I love that you brought up the Domino's pizza tracker example, because I've had customers use that before as an expectation in a bar setting. They would say, like, why can I know exactly what state my pizza is in and not know X, Y, and Z, right? And we know that it's not a one-to-one comparison. There's obviously a lot more complexity that goes into a pizza versus a down line, for example. But it's important to recognize, like, that's their ideal state, right? Like, that's their mental model that they're walking around with. They take a consumer experience over here and see how great it can be, and just immediately think it should be that easy and that seamless everywhere they go. And they're hyper aware when it doesn't meet those standards.
You bet. And I think for our industry, if we can get this outage when a little bit better in line with what customers' expectations are, we could transition to that to the extensions to customers. There are times that those are painful as well, and working with our design teams versus getting the information to the customer and how long it's going to take to build an extension or get service turned on. So there's ways to use this one as a springboard to more.
For sure, yeah. And I like that there's we always think of outage and communications around the actual outage event itself. But in reality, we know that outages are, a fraction of a 0.01% of the time occurrence. And then you're just like, well, why couldn't you tell your customer every other time, hey, are you aware that your reliability rate is 99.999 ad nauseum? And I think it's really easy for a customer to forget that, obviously, when their power goes out or anything like that, because suddenly they're hyper aware of it, right? But the more you can get in front of events like that to let them know, hey, we can't guarantee they won't happen, but here's what is going to take place when they do happen. Here's what we're doing to prevent them from happening, and then certainly during the event, and then post the event, letting them know, here's what we did while your power was out. I think everyone has this expectation of, my power is out and I look out my window, how come I don't see a truck by my curb? And they just automatically assume nothing's being done, right? But I think that's a great opportunity to educate them on, what actually it does mean.
Right. So we've talked about a couple examples now, and I think, Zach, you've got a little bit about here to share what the possibilities are and what's next after you've developed a journey map.
Absolutely. So once you have one, like I said earlier, when you identify those pain points, now comes time to prioritize them. So most often this is usually in alignment with your primary user, whoever your target demographic is going to align nicely with how you're prioritizing your pain points as well. Doesn't always mean that, but it also helps you to understand what things you're going to do first, second, and third. What pain points do you want to alleviate the most? What are you willing to hold off on? This can also take into account the level of effort. If it's something that is really painful, but also a really high effort to solve, you might have to reconsider if you do that first or not. Versus if something's really painful and it's low effort, that usually jumps to the top of your list. But this is a good exercise to go through to know how you're going to roll these out and how you're going to identify the solutions you're going to implement. From there, it's defining your desired outcomes. What is the actual experience or outcome you want to have throughout the experience? Again, going back to that ideal state. The example I always like to tell folks is, if you ask the average person what the ideal state of transportation is, eventually they will get to the answer instantaneous teleportation. And we all know that's not physically possible, so why is the exercise great? The exercise is great is because now you know what they have in their head as ideal state. And you might not be able to get to it, but you know what you should be working towards, and you want to get as close to it as you possibly can. So that's a great example of moving towards those desired outcomes, so you know just how far to push the envelope. Then you want to make sure you want to identify those metrics and success measures. As you develop and implement, change, transform, you absolutely want to make sure that you have some kind of system in place, process in place to capture current state. And then as you're changing into something new, you can actually measure the improvement over time. Because you want to know the impact you're having, you want to know where you were versus where you're going, and then you can absolutely communicate on the ROI, the investment that you're making, the development cost or the resource investment that you're making, and know that it's going towards some long-term goals and objectives. And then lastly, making the customer journey map actionable. I like to always talk about this one, as Brent mentioned earlier on. It's not just a pretty picture that you hang on your wall and you call it done. It's definitely something that is a springboard and a catalyst into very definable actions and project teams. There are the healthcare example earlier that I talked about was a one-time journey mapping experience, but it actually created about 2 years worth of projects and work for the organization. So it can be a very massive springboard into some really robust projects and hitting your goals and objectives there. As an example of one of the things I'll mention around this is human-centered design and some of the tools that you can use in parallel with creating a journey map. One of them is called task unification. So if you think of Uber, Uber started by journey mapping the taxi experience. What does it look like for the average person to hail a taxi, pay for a taxi, get in the taxi, get where they needed to go? And they realized through that the average person goes to work and their car sits idle, for 9-10 hours a day. And they said, well, what if we take the idle cars that just everyone already has but isn't using and turn those into taxis? So they basically added a new task onto an existing asset. That idea alone got them their Series A funding, 7-figure funding. So it's a very small thing in comparison to where Uber is today, but it just goes to show the kind of momentum that you can take when mapping out an experience and the possibilities that can come out of making a journey map actionable. And so as we finish out, one of the things that I like always to think about is that it's as you can see on the screen, it's very much a creative process. It's a snapshot in time. It's definitely meant to be, like I said, a springboard into something for you in the future. But it's always something that you can evolve and iterate on going forward. And Brent, I don't know if you've had experienced similar things, but I know that I've gone back and updated journey maps, and certainly as we implement new changes and things as well.
You bet. And the other thing that I think I've touched on just a little bit here, but it really gives us in the customer side of the business a little bit more of that ability to have a conversation about making these changes to the future. I found early on in my time in customer service coming from engineering that it was often difficult to explain the real benefit of making some of the changes for the customer. Oftentimes it looked like cost changes, cost impacts, and not benefits. So the journey map really helps you identify and realize what it's like to be a customer of your business. And so I think this really does bring in that, welcomes the creative people to create the creative process that oftentimes have a hard time delivering that softer, less measurable benefit.
All right, and with that, I think we're going to move on to our next poll question. Brian, if you want to drive us there, please.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Brent. This is really good information. Hopefully many of you can use it. Our next poll question is, what part of the customer journey mapping experience do you find you need the most help with? Is it identifying experiences, identifying users within the experience, brainstorming steps in the current experience, mapping out action steps, or other, if there's not something here listed that you think would most apply? So take a few seconds here to look at those opportunities. Once again, you really want to look at, for at least starting the process, identifying experiences to analyze, identify the users, cluster the users into similarities, interview the groups and get direct input, map out the actions, mediums, emotions, and behaviors, identify those pain points, and especially define your desired outcomes, and make the process actionable. And I think one of the other things that came up that I thought was really important is try not to normalize emergency situations when you create that initial map of interactions, but work on addressing the things, and don't be intimidated because you'll break down the whole thing into manageable bites before the map even gets created. So looks like a lot of people are interested in mapping out action steps and brainstorming steps in the current experience. So we'll leave this up for just a few more seconds before we go to the questions for the event. Oh, and apparently we have enough people here that selected other, so we're going to do the bonus round. And for those of you who did select other, if you could quickly type in a word or two on this section, that would be really helpful. And remember that the journey experience is something that's meant to make everybody's life easier in the long run. And as long as you factor in all of the actions, emotions, and behaviors involved, and make sure that everyone seems to have their own specific set of criteria, that we can hopefully mesh those together and create a singular experience and get to that activity. Okay, so now we're going to go to some questions that we got from the audience here. Let's see what we got. All right, so the first one is, what is the best way to start customer journey mapping if we don't know which product or service we want to start with? And by the way, if you still have questions, there's plenty of time to still submit them. But Zach or Brent, who wants to field that one for us?
Maybe I'll start, because I'll admit that I am not a journey mapping expert, just by nature of some of the improvements we've wanted to make in my career. We've landed on leaning on journey maps. So I would say that there are several groups in the space that are helpful in developing journey maps. So I would look, I'm sure Questline offers that. I'm guessing there are other resources out in the industry that you can look to get an expert to help you in that. So I would look for that expertise to help you along that path and pick a journey that you want to do that with.
Yeah, and I would echo that as well, Brett. Certainly Questline does that. The map I shared with, the chaotic complex journey through utility is something we created on behalf of one of our clients, certainly within our wheelhouse. But if you're a little bit unsure of where to start, um, it's great to look at your customer feedback. I think everybody pays close attention to customer satisfaction scores. And if you are particularly low in a category, it's a great place to start and just dive in and uncover exactly why is that? Why is that low? What are people actually thinking and feeling? And how does that feedback relate back to the experience they're having? Gives you a really good head start into, where to target your time and attention.
Good answers, gentlemen. This is a good one. How many customer journey maps should you make for one program or service? That's actually something I'm interested as well.
I'll start. Yeah. My thoughts on that are there's not really a metric or something that I would point to say, oh, here's the limit. You've done it. You've done as much as you need. Like I said, you can make these experiences as narrow or as long as you want. In reality, you could make one journey map that totally encompasses your entire company. It would stretch, across walls though, and it would be almost too big to manage. So what I typically see is you take a smaller, like start and stop point that you really want to zero in on, and you say, I want to make this one particular experience phenomenally better. And it could be a handful of steps. It could be over a period of time. That certainly accounts for it. But I think it's really great to, I would always start with like only a few, and look at similar ones that overlap and that involve one another. It becomes difficult if you say, I want to look at this experience in billing, and I want to look at this experience in my call center, and I want to look at this experience on my web and mobile app, because they're distinct enough that it might be hard to tie one of those two things together, versus if you just said, I'm going to really make my web and mobile experience just phenomenal. I'm going to make them stand out. What ends up happening is through that process, you will start to pick up threads on how those impact other areas of your overall experience, and then it gives you a really good indicator on where to go next.
Brent, you look like you had an answer as well. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Oh, I think it was covered well, but the one thing I would mention is that I always want to try to keep these linear, but that's not the way customer journey maps often work. And so you end up going down different paths. And so I would say start as linear as you can, a clear start and stop, but be willing to go down the different paths that it will take you. And I think that's probably the challenge to it, and why leaning on, if you don't have that expertise first, leaning on some help is not a bad thing at first.
Excellent. Oh, here's another good one. Who needs to be involved in the process of journey mapping? Zach, why don't you go first?
Sure. On this one, you need to have somebody involved that knows what your goals and outcomes should be, just somebody who can have the process discipline of the journey map to help facilitate. But outside of that, it gets really interesting because I like to involve folks that you might not normally think of. So if somebody doesn't directly interface with a customer, it doesn't mean they have to be excluded by any means. As long as they are at an engagement point in the journey, if they influence it in some manner, absolutely talk to them. This could be an administrative person behind the scenes that never talks to a customer. But if they're responsible for moving somebody through a queue, if they're responsible for making sure actions take place and they happen in a timely manner, this is clearly somebody who influences the journey, and this is clearly somebody that I would want to talk to. So that's where, when you go through that exercise of like mapping out your users, you get a lot of secondary and tertiary people that are just like, in the ether, that are involved. But these are people that you might find out can actually do you a lot of favors if they just, do something slightly different, or if they take on one additional action, they can expedite something that, typically, ends up in this like swirl pattern or something like that. But you'll get a good sense of who to involve and who not to involve as you kind of create this universal map of all around centered on your experience. You'll find people that have absolutely no impact with it whatsoever, And those are the folks that you can say, I don't need to talk to them because they don't have any influence here. But you also might find folks that you just never even thought to go talk to, who really do have a lot of influence over it.
Brent, I'll let you go on this, but I will let you go first for the next question.
Oh, good. So yeah, real quick on this topic, I find it good to build a cross-functional team of people that are interested in this topic, and whatever it is you're looking to. And in a utility, it's oftentimes those audiences I mentioned, the operations folks that can have an impact, whether it's a service order or an outage, IT groups that's going to be there building some of the integrations to whatever solution you end up trying to improve. So early on, getting as broad of a team involved as possible, it creates the buy-in that you need, but also helps those that have a different perspective make your product better, make your solution better.
Oh, looks like we got another one coming in real quickly. How are we, we are wanting to find out how our members view our organization. Is this process like a survey, and does it fit within the journey mapping that we talk about? Brent?
You bet. I think there's a lot of different ways you can probably go about doing that. Surveys are nice, but if you're going to get into specifics about a certain experience, I really do appreciate the interview portion of customer surveys. So if you can actually have some real conversations with with your customers to get that information from them, that's been a piece of several projects I've been on where we've been able to gather that, and it really does make a big difference in what your understanding is. Surveys can sometimes mislead, and just having a total summary of what your customers think is helpful, but sometimes that real interview is helpful.
Zach?
Yeah, I would certainly echo that as well. Like I said, you can learn a ton of information in a 15-minute conversation with a single person. And like I said, you don't need dozens of these. You certainly don't need hundreds of these conversations to get off the ground and running. And there's usually some creative ways that you can figure out about how to get those conversations moving. There's always creative ways to get folks. It doesn't always have to be incentivized. Like I said, usually when you tell people why you're calling and that you're looking for their input in helping design something, create something better for them, every time that I've done it, they've been more than willing to talk to me.
And there's a follow-up question to that, just real quick. I know I'm going rogue just a little bit. It says, so this would be the process after an organization does a survey to determine where improvement is needed? I would say yes. That's kind of the way I've done it, is the survey, the broader survey kind of tells you where some pain points are. The journey map helps you fix some of the pain points, and you know that it's from the larger audience. That's one of the things that you may struggle with as a company. Sorry to take over like that.
You can concur, Zach?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great way to proceed.
Okay. One more just came in. About how long does it take to complete a customer journey map on average? And I know that's a very broad question.
I could start with a few examples. I've done some that have taken 2 weeks, and they've been fully actionable. They've been fully validated and vetted. Again, it depends on how long of an experience do you truly want to map out. In my view, this is not something that should take you 6 months. If it's taking that long, I think you're trying to do way too much in a single journey. For me, it's a matter of weeks over months, because I think you can, the cool thing about a journey map is once you start mapping it out, your high-level steps, you can immediately start garnering insights on each stage of the journey. And as you learn new things that come in, they help populate and fill in other areas. So it's a naturally evolving thing. It's kind of like a self-propagating tool that as you fill in these new insights, it's actually answering questions that you might have already had. So it can actually go exponentially quick as you go through the process. Brent, I don't know if you've had experiences similar to that.
Yeah, my experience is that usually it's a little longer, but I've mentioned I'm trying to bring in larger groups from different parts of the organization, so I take my time to get buy-in, and sometimes it's 2 to 3 months, and it can go longer than that, but that seems to be a fair, unrushed pace to get people that might have at first not been fully on board with what we were even attempting to do. So I think that's a good pace at a utility anyway, in my experience, 2 to 3 months.
Hey,
That's a good point.
okay, sorry, Zach.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you have, if you're thinking like, if you tack in change management as a thing that needs to happen prior to doing this, then yeah, you can certainly elongate it based on the organization.
Now, my hope is that in the future, this becomes part of our normal way of figuring out what we should improve, and that we can get to those few week programs.
Definitely.
Hey, we have time for one more quick question. This attendee said their audio cut off, and you might have covered this, but what are some tips when brainstorming the current experience and when creating action steps? Could you keep your answers a little bit brief, and we'll move on? Brent?
Zach, go ahead. Oh, okay. Yeah, so what I mentioned, just getting a group together to review what we're seeing in these experiences. I think actually we have done that with, I mentioned our IT group and our operations folks and our customer teams brainstorming what we think the customers really expect. We base the results on what we're using as JD Power survey, and we base our decision on how do we move that needle. So trying to stay brief, but really create the action step based on moving the needle on JD Power is what we've done.
Zach?
Yeah, and I would say that I like to, if no other place to start, I like to interview folks within the organization first and just ask them, like, what do you think your experience is like? And then know what that is as a baseline. And then I will put myself and some other folks on our team through the experience to be like an objective party. And then we can create side-by-side comparisons to say, this is what you think it's like. This is actually what the reality is, right? Because it can be hard to separate us and to have a hyper-objective view when you're on the inside. So that's where it does help to have somebody from an outside perspective come in and give you that competing view. And from that exercise alone, I think you can identify immediately some areas to target to then go explore and say, you know what, this is really an area that we want to investigate. And I think that kicks you off in a really nice way into those immediate next steps and action items.
Thank you, guys. That's really been helpful for people, hopefully, and I know I learned a lot. We've run out of time, so we'll have our last, if we missed addressing your question during the webinar, we'll follow up offline. So our final poll question for the day, while you're doing that, I'll finish with a quick recap of what was shared today. So poll question number 4, how useful was the information presented in this webinar today? Not very valuable, slightly, moderately, very, or extremely. And feel free to click on one of those. While you're doing that, some of the key takeaways, hopefully, that you got from this event today. Customer journey maps need to be inclusive of the entire customer experience from start to finish. There are numerous benefits of customer journey mapping, including improving customer satisfaction and JD Power scores. Customer journey maps extend to all industries, including, of course, energy utility industries, but also healthcare, entertainment, and retail. Make sure you identify the users within the experience you are trying to map out. Try not to forget to identify your metrics and success measurements. And finally, make sure you make those journey maps actionable. I want to thank Zach and Brent for your excellent insights. And hopefully your audience, thank you for attending today and your great questions. Let's now go to Maureen and hear some closing comments from her.
Thank you, Brian. And I would like to thank all of you for attending our webinar today. As a reminder, the presentation materials and the playback link to the recording of today's webinar will be emailed to you within the next couple of days. Should you have any additional questions or feedback, please don't hesitate to contact us. Remember to set aside March 24th for our next Plugged In webinar, where we will discuss our 2022 Energy Utility Benchmarks Report. Thanks again for attending, and have a great day, everyone.